10 seconds. That's all it took. 10 seconds for a man with a rifle and 2 metal cylinders to do what mortars, artillery, and waves of Allied soldiers could not. 10 seconds to turn the calculus of an entire battle. But to understand those 10 seconds, to grasp what they cost and what they meant, you need to know about the man who crawled forward into the darkness with a wool cap liner instead of a helmet, knowing that the German observation post ahead had already killed better-equipped men than him. You need to understand April 5, 1945 and Castle Aghinolfi, and what it meant to lead men who had been told their entire lives they weren't fit to lead. You need to understand Vernon Baker. The Italian spring had come late that year, reluctant and cold. The Gothic Line, Germany's last major defensive position in northern Italy, stretched across the Apennine Mountains like a wound that wouldn't close. For months, Allied forces had beaten themselves bloody against it. Villages that had stood for centuries were reduced to skeletal ruins. Vineyards became graveyards, and in the hills above the coastal town of Viareggio, Castle Aghinolfi sat like a clenched fist. A medieval fortress transformed into a modern killing ground, bristling with German machine guns, mortars, and artillery observers who could call down fire on anything that moved below. The 92nd Infantry Division had been given the castle. Not as a prize, as a problem. They were Buffalo Soldiers, the only black infantry division in the European theater, led mostly by white officers who ranged from competent to openly contemptuous. The army had hesitated to deploy them at all. When they finally did, it was to the Italian mountains in winter, terrain that ate men and machines, against German positions that had already chewed up experienced units. The 92nd was under-equipped, under-trained for mountain warfare, and operating under the weight of an institutional assumption that they would fail. Some commanders seemed to expect it. Some seemed to want it. Vernon Baker was 24 years old that April, which made him young for a second lieutenant and old for a man who had grown up in Wyoming during the Depression, orphaned at 4, raised by grandparents who taught him to work hard and expect nothing. He had tried to enlist after Pearl Harbor and been turned away. The Army wasn't taking black men for combat roles yet. When they finally did, when the need for bodies outweighed the commitment to segregation, he had gone through officer candidate school at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, where he learned infantry tactics and how to lead men who looked like him in an army that didn't want either of them. He was quiet, watchful, and extraordinarily competent. His men noticed. So did some of his superiors, though not always favorably. A black officer who showed initiative could be seen as uppity. A black officer who succeeded could be an embarrassment. By early April, the 92nd had been trying to take Castle Aghinolfi for weeks. They had thrown men at it. They had shelled it. The castle swallowed them all. It sat on a ridge with interlocking fields of fire, every approach covered, every dead space mined or wired. German defenders had months to prepare. They knew the terrain like their own skin. They had observation posts dug into the hillside below the castle walls, camouflaged so well that men walked past them and died without ever seeing where the fire came from. Machine gun nests were sited to create kill zones. Mortar teams had pre-registered every likely assembly area. The Germans were outnumbered in Italy by the spring of 1945. Everyone knew that. But here they had the ground and they had time and they were absolutely willing to kill you if you tried to take either away from them. Captain John Runyon, Baker's company commander, was a white officer from the South. He was not the worst. That was something. He listened when Baker spoke, which put him ahead of some. But he was also green, and the castle had been eating at him, and on April 4th he told Baker to take his platoon, the weapons platoon of Company C, 370th Infantry Regiment, and conduct a reconnaissance in force. Find the German positions. Map them. Report back. Simple on paper. Suicidal in practice. Everyone knew it. Baker knew it. He looked at his men. 25 soldiers, most of them younger than him, some of them barely old enough to shave, and he knew that some of them would not come back. That was the mathematics of it. The only question was how many, and whether their deaths would mean anything. They moved out before dawn on April 5th, in that gray pre-dawn cold when the world is all shadows and your breath hangs in the air and every sound seems too loud. Baker wore his wool cap liner because he had learned that steel helmets ring like bells when branches hit them, and in the thick brush on the approaches to Castle Aghinolfi, silence mattered more than protection. He carried his M1 Garand rifle, a weapon he knew intimately, had fired thousands of times, could field strip blindfolded. He also carried grenades, fragmentation grenades, white phosphorus grenades, and the knowledge that he was leading his men into a place that had already killed better-equipped soldiers than them. The plan was reconnaissance. The reality was that reconnaissance in the face of a fortified enemy position is just combat with extra steps. The hillside was steep, covered in scrub oak and brambles that caught at clothing and equipment. The castle loomed above them, gray stone against gray sky, silent and malevolent. As they climbed, Baker spread his men out, keeping them low, moving slowly. Speed got you killed. Impatience got you killed. The whole hillside could be watching you, and you'd never know until the machine guns opened up. He had learned that lesson in training and then learned it again in combat, where the lesson came with blood. They were perhaps 400 yards from the castle walls when they encountered the first German position. It was an observation post, a concealed dugout with a firing slit looking down the hill. Baker spotted it only because he saw the metal edge of the slit catch the early light. Another man might have called in artillery. Another man might have sent soldiers forward to suppress it with rifle fire. Baker did neither. Artillery would alert every German position on the hill. Rifle fire from a distance gave the defenders time to respond, time to call for support, time to make this a pitched battle his undersized platoon could not win. Instead, Baker hand-signaled his men to freeze. Then he began to crawl. The ground was rocky and uneven. Every movement had to be controlled. A dislodged stone rolling downhill could give him away. A rustle in the brush could draw fire. He moved inches at a time, watching the slit, waiting for any sign that he had been seen. His heart hammered, but his hands were steady. Fear makes the body react. Training and will make it obey anyway. 30 yards. 20. The slit was perhaps 18 inches wide. A dark horizontal slash in the camouflaged facade. Behind it were men with weapons who would kill him if they saw him coming. He had 2 metal cylinders, grenades, and his rifle. He had one chance to do this right. At 10 yards he could hear them. Low German voices, casual, bored even. They were observers, probably watching the approaches, ready to call down mortar or artillery fire on any Allied movement. They did not expect someone to crawl up to their position in the near dark. That was insane. That violated every principle of sensible military tactics, which is exactly why it might work. Baker moved the last few yards in a slow-motion combat crawl, his rifle cradled in his arms, his breathing controlled. When he reached the edge of the dugout, he could smell cigarette smoke. One of them was smoking. He was that close. He rose to a crouch, pulled the pins on both grenades, and tossed them through the slit in one fluid motion. Then he dropped flat. The explosion was massive, contained and amplified by the dugout's confined space. Smoke and dust blew out of the slit. There were no screams. The concussion alone would have been devastating in that enclosed space. Before the smoke cleared, Baker was moving. He shoved the barrel of his M1 Garand through the observation slit and fired 8 rounds as fast as he could pull the trigger. The full clip, the distinctive ping of the en-bloc clip ejecting sounding impossibly loud in the sudden silence after the grenades. Inside the dugout, 2 German soldiers who had somehow survived the grenade blast were killed by rifle fire in their own fortification, unable to maneuver, unable to return fire, dead before they understood what was happening. 10 seconds, maybe less. The first German position was eliminated. But now the entire hillside knew someone was coming. Baker's platoon was already moving forward. They had been trained to exploit success, to press through confusion, to move when the enemy was reacting. A camouflaged machine gun nest opened up from the left, the distinctive ripping canvas sound of an MG-42 tearing through the morning air. The Germans called it Hitler's Buzzsaw. It fired 1,200 rounds per minute and could cut a man in half. Baker saw the muzzle flash, saw where the camouflage netting was set, and realized the position was sighted to cover the main approach to the observation post he had just destroyed. They had layered their defenses. Of course they had. He shouted orders, directing his men to cover, and then he was moving again, flanking right, using dead ground, using every fold in the terrain. Another soldier might have called for support. Another soldier might have gone to ground and traded fire from a distance. Baker closed. The MG-42 crew never saw him coming. They were focused downslope, firing in controlled bursts at movement in the brush where Baker's men were pinned. He came at them from the side, from an angle they had not prepared for, and he killed them with grenades and rifle fire before they could traverse the machine gun. The buzzsaw went silent. His men advanced. They were perhaps 200 yards from the castle walls now, and the Germans were fully alert. Mortar rounds began to fall. Mortars are terror weapons. You can hear them coming. A distant hollow thump of the tube, then a whistle as the round arcs overhead, then the shriek as it descends, and you have perhaps 2 seconds to decide whether to run or go flat or pray. They were falling all around Baker's platoon now, erupting in geysers of dirt and shrapnel. Men screamed. Men went down. Baker kept moving, kept directing his men, kept trying to maintain cohesion and momentum even as the fire intensified. He found another concealed dugout, partially hidden behind a stone wall. He could see movement inside. German infantry, probably a rifle squad, positioned to cover yet another approach. The defenses were interlocking, mutually supporting. Taking one position exposed you to fire from the next. It was textbook defensive planning, and it was murderously effective. Baker pulled a white phosphorus grenade from his belt. Willie Pete, the soldiers called it. White phosphorus burned at 5,000 degrees. It burned through equipment. It burned through flesh. It burned underwater. It was terrible and it was effective, and in that moment Baker needed effective more than he needed mercy. He threw the grenade through the opening of the dugout and turned away from the flash. The screams that followed were brief and inhuman. White phosphorus did not give you time to scream for long. When the smoke cleared, the dugout was neutralized. Baker moved on. The pattern repeated. Another machine gun nest, this one firing from a spider hole so well concealed that Baker almost walked past it. He spotted it only because he saw the gunner's helmet shift slightly. He killed the crew with his Thompson submachine gun, a weapon he had picked up from a fallen soldier, firing from close range in short controlled bursts. The Thompson was not accurate at distance, but at 10 feet it was devastating. Then another position. Then another. Each time Baker was at the front. Each time he was the one taking the risk, making the approach, eliminating the threat. His men followed because he led. Because he did not ask them to do anything he would not do first. Because in the chaos and terror of combat, they could look forward and see their lieutenant moving toward the enemy, not away from it. But the cost was mounting. The German mortars were relentless. Baker watched men he had trained with, men he had led, men whose families he could name, get torn apart by shrapnel. The platoon that had started with 25 men was down to perhaps 15. Then 12. The wounded were being dragged to cover, but there was no good cover, not really, not under indirect fire. Baker kept pushing forward because stopping meant dying. Momentum was survival. The Germans had to be kept reacting, kept off balance, or they would mass their fire and annihilate what remained of the platoon. Then Captain Runyon arrived. He came up with some of the other company officers, moving along the route Baker's platoon had cleared. He took one look at the casualties, at the incoming mortar fire, at the German positions that were still firing from the castle walls and the surrounding hillside, and something in him broke. Baker saw it happen. Saw the man's face go pale. Saw the calculation behind his eyes shift from attack to retreat. Runyon gave the order to withdraw. Not to consolidate. Not to hold what they had taken. To withdraw. To give up the ground they had paid for in blood. Baker protested. They had cleared the approaches. They had destroyed the forward observation posts that had made this hillside impassable for weeks. They had the Germans reacting instead of dictating. If they pulled back now, every man they had lost died for nothing. The Germans would reoccupy the positions, recite their defenses, and the next attempt would cost just as much or more. They had to hold. They had to press. Runyon would not listen. He was the captain. He gave the order. Baker was the second lieutenant. He was supposed to obey. For a long moment, Vernon Baker stood on that hillside and weighed duty against sense. Obedience against responsibility. He had been trained to follow orders. The entire military structure depended on it. But he had also been trained to lead, to assess situations, to make decisions under fire. And he could see with brutal clarity that withdrawing now would waste everything they had done. It would also leave his wounded men exposed if the withdrawal turned into a rout. He made a choice. He would obey the order to withdraw. But he would do it right. Baker organized the retreat. He positioned men to provide covering fire. He ensured the wounded were carried, not abandoned. And as the platoon began to pull back, he stayed at the rear, closest to the enemy, directing fire, suppressing German positions that tried to exploit the withdrawal. When German infantry attempted to follow, drawn out by the sight of Americans retreating, Baker killed them. He destroyed 2 more machine gun nests during the withdrawal, using white phosphorus grenades, denying the Germans positions from which they could enfilade the retreating Americans. He moved from position to position, firing, displacing, firing again, a one-man rearguard action that kept the withdrawal from becoming a massacre. At one point, German soldiers approached under a Red Cross flag. Baker held his fire, as the laws of war required. Then he saw they were carrying weapons, that the Red Cross was a deception, an attempt to get close enough to his positions to attack under the guise of medical neutrality. It was a war crime, and it was also tactically clever in a vicious sort of way. Baker did not hesitate. He shot them. He killed men who were attempting to hide behind the symbol that was supposed to protect medics and wounded. It was necessary, and it was ugly, and there would be no investigation because on this hillside, in this moment, there were no witnesses who mattered to anyone making decisions at higher headquarters. By the time Baker got his men back to friendly lines, the platoon was shattered. Of the 25 men who had started the mission, only 7 were still combat effective. The rest were dead, wounded, or psychologically shattered. Baker was exhausted, filthy, his uniform torn and stained with blood. Some his own from shrapnel wounds he had barely noticed, most from men he had carried or tried to save. He had been under fire for hours. He had personally destroyed approximately a dozen German positions. He had killed at least 20 German soldiers, probably more. He had led a fighting withdrawal under conditions that should have resulted in the complete destruction of his unit. And he had done it all with minimal support, minimal resources, and under the command of an officer who had collapsed under pressure. He filed his report. He detailed the German positions his men had eliminated. He noted that the approaches to Castle Aghinolfi were now clear of forward observers and interlocking machine gun positions. He recommended an immediate follow-up attack while the Germans were still disorganized. Then he collapsed into exhausted sleep that was more like unconsciousness. The next day, American forces took Castle Aghinolfi without significant resistance. The Germans had withdrawn during the night. The castle that had held up the Allied advance for weeks, that had cost dozens of American lives in failed assaults, fell without a fight because Vernon Baker and his platoon had destroyed its outer defenses and broken the cohesion of its garrison. The official reports noted the castle's capture. They did not dwell on how it had been made possible. Baker's company commander, Captain Runyon, was recommended for a decoration for the action. He received it. Vernon Baker received no immediate recognition beyond a verbal commendation. This was not unusual. Decorations for black soldiers were rare in World War II, the result of both bureaucratic indifference and active racism within the command structure. Recommendations for black soldiers were often downgraded or ignored entirely. When medals were given, they were typically lesser awards. The Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration, was not awarded to a single African American soldier during World War II for actions in Europe, despite thousands of black soldiers serving in combat roles and numerous documented acts of extraordinary valor. The pattern held for decades. Baker finished the war. He stayed in the Army, serving in the Airborne, eventually retiring as a first lieutenant. He carried the memory of April 5, 1945, with him, the men he had led, the men he had lost, the ground they had taken, the recognition they had not received. He did not speak about it much. What was there to say? The official record said one thing. The men who had been there knew another. And the men who had been there were mostly dead or scattered or struggling with their own wounds, visible and invisible. In the 1990s, the Army commissioned a study. It was prompted by questions long overdue about why no African American soldiers had received the Medal of Honor for World War II actions in Europe. The study reviewed thousands of records. It examined witness statements, after-action reports, commendation recommendations. It applied the same standards that had been used for white soldiers. When it was finished, the study identified 7 African American soldiers whose actions clearly met the criteria for the Medal of Honor but who had been passed over. Vernon Baker was one of them. He was also the only one still alive. On January 13, 1997, 52 years after the battle at Castle Aghinolfi, President Bill Clinton awarded Vernon Baker the Medal of Honor in a ceremony at the White House. Baker was 77 years old. Most of the men who had fought with him were dead. The officers who had failed to recognize his actions at the time were dead. The institutional racism that had denied him recognition was acknowledged but not really addressed, spoken of in the past tense as though it were a problem that had been solved rather than a wound that had scarred over without healing properly. Baker accepted the medal. He spoke briefly, with the same quiet competence he had shown on that Italian hillside more than 5 decades earlier. He noted that he was receiving the honor on behalf of all the black soldiers who had fought and died without recognition. He did not sound bitter. He sounded tired. He sounded like a man who had carried something heavy for a very long time and was finally being allowed to set it down, though the weight of it had already done its damage. The medal is kept in a museum now. It represents 10 seconds of combat and hours of fighting and a lifetime of waiting for recognition that came too late to matter to the men who had earned it alongside Baker. It represents institutional failure wrapped in eventual acknowledgement. It represents courage that was never in question and honor that was grudgingly, belatedly extended. Vernon Baker died in 2010. He was 90 years old. He is buried in Arlington National Cemetery, which is fitting because he earned that honor through his service, though one might argue he earned it specifically on a hillside in Italy in 1945 when he did what his country asked of him despite knowing his country would not value it properly. Castle Aghinolfi still stands. It is a tourist attraction now, offering views of the Tuscan coast and the mountains beyond. Visitors walk the grounds where German machine guns once covered interlocking fields of fire. They admire the medieval architecture and the strategic positioning. Few of them know what happened there in April 1945. Fewer still know the name Vernon Baker or understand what he did, crawling forward with 2 grenades and a rifle and a determination to do the job right even when the system he served was designed to minimize and dismiss him. The question that lingers is not whether Vernon Baker was brave. The evidence of that is overwhelming and undeniable. The question is what we owe to people like him, people who do the necessary, terrible work of combat under conditions of official doubt and systemic discrimination, who lead when leadership is needed regardless of whether recognition follows, who hold the line not because glory awaits but because the line needs holding and they are capable of holding it. The easy answer is medals and ceremonies and historical recognition. The harder answer is that we owe them the kind of country that would not have made them fight for recognition in the first place, that would not have required them to prove their humanity and courage against the dual enemies of fascism abroad and racism at home. Baker was asked once, years after the war, what had gone through his mind when he crawled toward that German observation post, when he pulled the pins on those grenades and committed to an action that could easily have gotten him killed. He said he was thinking about his men, about getting them through, about doing the job, not about glory or medals or proving anything to anyone. Just about the work that needed doing and his responsibility to do it. It is perhaps the most devastating statement of leadership I have encountered, devastating because it is so plain, so unadorned by ego or expectation, so focused on duty without the promise of reward. There is a photograph of Baker late in his life. He is wearing his Medal of Honor around his neck. His face is lined and weathered but his eyes are clear. He looks like what he was. A soldier, a leader, a man who had done hard things and lived with the memory of them. He does not look triumphant. He looks weary. Satisfied perhaps, but weary. The recognition came too late to undo the injustice, too late to honor the men who had died beside him, too late to change the calculus of that moment on the hillside when he had to choose between obedience and effectiveness and chose a difficult middle path that saved lives at the cost of his own safety. The story of Vernon Baker is not a story of eventual triumph over racism. It is a story of excellence and courage rendered despite racism. in the face of institutional barriers that should never have existed. The Medal of Honor he received does not erase the decades of being overlooked. The acknowledgement from President Clinton does not resurrect the soldiers who died that day or the ones who came home broken and received no recognition at all. What the medal represents, perhaps, is not justice but the bare minimum of acknowledgement. A recognition that yes, this happened, yes, it mattered, yes, the man who did it was worthy of the honor his country had withheld from him. The tactical lessons from Castle Aghinolfi are taught at military academies now. The importance of reconnaissance, the value of aggressive leadership, the effectiveness of surprise and close combat against fortified positions. These lessons are valuable and worth teaching, but they are incomplete if they do not also include the lesson that Vernon Baker learned and carried with him, that excellence is its own requirement, that you do the job because it needs doing, that leadership means going first regardless of whether anyone will remember that you did. 10 seconds changed the battle. 52 years changed the record. But neither interval changed what actually happened on that hillside, what it cost, or what it revealed about the man who crawled forward into enemy fire because his men needed him to and because he had the skill and the courage to do what others could not or would not. Vernon Baker was a soldier. That is the beginning and end of it. Everything else, the racism, the delayed recognition, the institutional failures, those are footnotes to the essential fact of his competence and courage under fire. The American military is different now, integrated, officially committed to equality, reformed in ways that would have been unimaginable in 1945. This is progress. It is real progress. But progress does not undo history. It does not restore the years Vernon Baker spent knowing what he had done and knowing it had not been properly valued. It does not resurrect the soldiers who fought and died in segregated units, who came home to a country that honored their service in theory but denied them opportunities in practice. The medal around Baker's neck in that late-life photograph represents a debt acknowledged but never truly repaid. If you take nothing else from this story, take this: Vernon Baker crawled forward when others would have stayed back. He led when others collapsed. He fought with precision and purpose against an enemy that wanted to kill him and within a system that did not want to honor him. He did it anyway, not because he was promised recognition, not because the system was fair, but because the work needed doing and he was capable of doing it, and his men deserved a leader who would not fail them even if the institution failed him. That is the standard. That is what earned looks like. And 52 years of delay does not diminish it. It only highlights how long injustice can persist even in the face of undeniable truth. If the story meant something to you, if you made it to the end because you needed to know what happened to Vernon Baker and the men who fought with him, then subscribe to this channel. Hit the like button not because I'm asking but because stories like this deserve to be shared, because histories that were suppressed or ignored need to be brought forward, because Vernon Baker and the thousands of soldiers like him earned our attention and our memory. And here's the question I want you to sit with: how many other Vernon Bakers were there? How many acts of courage went unrecognized not because they weren't witnessed but because the witnesses didn't matter to the people writing the official histories? How do we account for excellence when the accounting system was designed to overlook it? Think about that. And remember that when Vernon Baker was asked why he risked his life that day, he said it was about his men, about the work, about duty. Not glory, just duty. That's leadership. That's what it looks like when the system fails but the man does not.